All right, guys, I got something to show you. Take a listen. Hey, it's Kley. Welcome to another video. This is going to be the grand finale, at least for now, of my 6v6 Hi-Fi tube amp build. This has been a really fun build, and I want to do just one final look over, look at the amp, see everything that I've done, document the circuit. I've got a little taste test here of a sound clip to give you a little idea of what it's like, and to kind of give you my impressions of the build as a whole. So let's go ahead and dive in and check it out. Okay, to start off with, I wanted to do an overview of the exterior of the amp. It's pretty straightforward in terms of features, but just for the sake of everything, just wanted to go through it all one more time. So to start, this is a plate of sheet steel that I got from my local hardware store. I believe it's 18 inches across and 8 inches front to back. And I did not cut it down at all lengthwise. I basically just got it like this and have left it like this. But I did do a lot of work to drill all the holes. Then I got this. This is an aluminum right angle, and I've just attached it with 3 screws and nuts and washers to give me my front plate. Now, one thing that I am also working on to finish this guy is to do a little bit of woodworking. I've got this kind of horseshoe-shaped piece right here that is going to go kind of around the back and sides, but I do need to make some cutouts because the spacing isn't quite right. But that's something that I'll be working on here in the near future to finish it up. But for today's purposes, it's a good amp and it's working really well. This is my power transformer. It's a classic tone 40-18021. I believe it's designed for a 5E3 Tweed Deluxe, and I found that it works completely fine powering 2 6v6s and a tube rectifier. It actually turned out that it worked pretty fine for my build. I've got an IEC power cord plug right here. This is my choke. This is a Mercury Magnetics FB-DR-C choke. So again, I think this is designed for a deluxe reverb. So that choke is working totally fine, and it's helping to filter my voltage going to my preamp tube. Then I've got 2 EdCore output transformers. These guys are modeled GXSE10-8-5K. So it's a 10 watt rated output transformer, 8 ohm output with a 5K ohm primary. It also does have a screen tap so it can do ultra lead, but I currently have it wired up into pentode mode. And then this is my tube setup. I've got my 5Y3 tube rectifier out here, my 2 6v6s, and then I have a 12AU7 currently here in V1 for my preamp tube. Then to my front panel, I did a lot of reorganizing on this throughout the build. So it looks a little janky, but it works. I've got my power cord right here, on and off. I've got my 120 volt LED indicator light and my fuse. And then I've got my 2 stereo 1/4 inch input jacks. Then the only other thing is I do have speaker wire, which is currently hard soldered to the output. But I am going to get some banana plugs to get that finished up here pretty shortly. This is where all the magic really happens. I'm actually going to do a full walkthrough of the circuit as I see it and highlight pretty much everything right now. So we're going to go through this, and if you've never really understood what a tube amp does, hopefully this will be helpful. And also this will be a landmark for me to see how I have wired everything up and be beneficial just for, I will also include a schematic that I'll draw up on this as well to make sure I've documented everything I've done, but let's go ahead and take a look. Okay, so I got my power side over here. Here's the 120 volt AC plug. This is the hot leg running this yellow wire into my fuse. The fuse is going over here to the switch, and the switch completes over here to the primary side of the power transformer. The other black wire runs to the other side of the switch. The bottom leg goes right here to this bolt, and it's soldered to this crimp-on tab, which is bolted to the chassis with a sole bolt. This is your safety ground to make sure that if the chassis ever becomes live with voltage, you always have a path to earth to keep the amp safe. So your chassis will never become live with this wiring setup. My LED, I'm taking off of the weak side, or I think the common or neutral side of my power plug, going to one end, and then the other end is also tapping off here of this primary side of the power transformer. So it basically is in parallel with the two black leads from the power transformer. So then coming out the secondary side, I've got a couple of center taps here. I believe the center tap for the B+ and the center tap for my heater wires are both going to this bolt on to the chassis. Then I have this green wire here is going to my filaments, which are connected to this terminal strip, which run here to here, here to here, here to here. So that's my tightly twisted pair, and I'm trying to keep these a little bit more vertical, kind of in this direction, up off the chassis, whereas like all these signal wires are kind of down closer to the chassis, and I find that helps to kind of keep these AC wires away from everything else. They tend to cause some problems. So trying to keep them away from the sensitive input components. Then this yellow wires right here are my 6-volt filament windings for my 5-way 3 rectifier. They're just wired directly to pins, I believe it's 2 and 8 of my octal 5Y3 socket right here. And then this red wire, this is my high voltage B+ line, so I think it's probably kicking out, I don't remember the specs off the top of my head, but somewhere in the range of 300 to 350 volts of AC is coming out of the power transformer. This is going in up here to pins 4 and 6. I believe that's the plate of this rectifier tube. And so as it goes through the rectifier, I have another wire here on pin 8. This is going to kick out your rectified DC. That's going over here to my PCB. This line tracks on the traces here to here to here. I have a little jumper here because I did have some thoughts about including some additional filtering, so if I did want to introduce like a full-on 200 milliamp choke and run the entire signal through it for some extra filtering and smoothing, I can do that, but I chose not to do that, so I'm just jumpering it for now, which leads me to this junction right here. This is kind of a hot and heavy point. First, we got this yellow wire, which goes to my first filter cap. Second, we've got this black wire, which runs out to that choke, which you saw on the top. And then we also have this red wire, which runs all the way out here, which connects to my power transformer to ultimately bring voltage to the plates of the power tubes. But this is the first tap in the B+, which is going off to the plates. So then it comes back here through the choke to the second node, where we've got another yellow wire going to the second smoothing capacitor. We also have the 4.7K dropping resistor. And then we also have a tap here going over here to the 6V6s, which I think this is pin 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which I think is our screen. So this is wired as a pentode. So if you look at like a 5F1 champ, I just copied the way that 6V6 is wired right there. And then there is a tap on my PCB going up here to the top for like an ultra linear switch, but I am not using that currently. It's just wired as a pentode to keep things simple, and I may revisit that at some point in the future. Then coming out of this dropping resistor, we've got one more connection here to this third filter cap, and then it basically runs into the 12AX7 or the 12AU7. And I do believe that these two resistors right here are supplying that voltage with some, I believe they're 10K dropping resistors onto the plates. So that's my power supply, so to speak. Everything I think came out really well. I'm happy with that. Like I said, the only real change I would consider making is adding that additional filtering here, which would require another filter capacitor and probably a very large choke to just get an additional layer of filtering, which would be probably kind of nice given that this is a single-ended triode Hifi amp, so you are a little less forgiving in terms of noise. So it'd be nice to get a stage of filtering before you get to the 6v6s, but I'm pretty happy with where things are at right now. So now I want to do the audio signal path. I've got my 2 1/4-inch jacks. This was a big change. I initially had them over here, which was a terrible idea because it basically would need to run over this AC heater line and over all these 2 6v6s to get over to this area where the input circuitry is. And that was just a terrible idea. So I moved it over here, and I have 2 resistors. One is the 1 meg grid stop or grid leak resistor, I believe, which goes from the input to ground. And then then we've got this grid stopping resistor, which is running from the input to my grids of the 2 sides of this input triode. I believe that's a pretty larger value than what I've seen on some of my guitar amps. And actually, now that I look at the schematic, it's at 3K, which would be actually a little bit lower. But overall, that's going to help just to get things going. Now, I did make some changes here from the input circuitry. Like I said, I'm basically running these point-to-point directly from the input to ground and also from the input to the grid of the tube socket. Before, I actually had circuitry here to send the inputs to an input spot here, and then I would have room for a volume control, which I did not actually implement in this build because the signal that I'm getting is coming from a audio interface, which is kind of a DAC, and it also has a volume control on it. So I'm using that volume control to kind of set the levels for this, and I'm just running this thing flat out all the time, and I found for my purpose that actually works really well. So I don't have any volume control here. We just go directly into the tube. Now I biased this a little bit differently than what I initially had planned because it's a 12AU7. I required different bias. So typically, if it's a 12AX7, I'd run 100K on the plate and like a 1.5K on the cathode. And you can see those connections are kind of in this area. I got my 2 cathodes right here and my 2 plates right here. But I think I've got actually 10K on the plates and 820 ohms on the cathode. So I did bias these specifically for a 12AU7, which was a very different type of bias than the 12AX7. So then coming out of the plates, we've got these 2 large blocking resistors here that help to decouple this stage from that high B plus voltage, which is really nice. And then we kind of run over here. I've got 220K going to ground, and I've also got 3K going into the grid of these 2 6v6s. And all of that, those components I think are in this area and in this area. And then one change I did also make is I'm not running any negative feedback. So the negative feedback actually was scheduled to go from the plate of the 6v6 back to the plate of the triode. But I elected to take that out. My feeling is with this amp, I'm running it at pretty high volume as far as like that volume control I got on my audio interface. But that high volume really is, the negative feedback brought it down maybe a little bit too much. So I felt like the way I'm setting up this amp and running it, the negative feedback was not benefiting me or helping me. I didn't have really gain to spare. And so I just elected to do away with that. And I don't regret that decision at all. I think it actually was the right choice with how this amp came out. Then with my 2 6v6s, really the only thing left is I've got my cathodes. So I've got 470 ohm cathode bias resistors, and these are 100 microfarad 25 volt cathode bypass capacitors. And they sound great with this amp, and I'm really pleased with how all this came out. From there, we go directly to the output onto the plates into the output transformer, which is kind of out over in this area. And now at some point, I imagine I will go ahead and put a better, more long-term solution. This is a little bit jerry-rigged. I mean, it's going to sound really good, but it's not so convenient. If I ever want to test out different amplifiers or speakers, it's going to be really difficult to deal with. So I imagine I will put some RCA or banana plugs in here at some point. But for now, I don't regret this. It's actually kind of nice having it hardwired, so that I don't have to worry about mucking around with anything. But it's just something to look forward to in the future. But overall, I'm really pleased with how this amp came out. So next up, let's go ahead and do a little tone test and give you guys a feel for how it sounds in my room. So I hope you guys enjoyed this project. I know that I sure did. I'm really pleased with this amp. I've really taken some time to get to know it and to listen to it extensively in my listening room. With my daughters, we listen to music almost daily. And I found that it's a ton of fun to have this amp, which I made, into speakers, which I made from a computer that I made. You know, I just really enjoy, and I'm getting a lot of satisfaction over having that handprint on it. And just to give you a little bit of contrast, so previously I was running a solid-state Technics receiver, probably from the 80s or 90s, that I got for super cheap on Craigslist. And the receiver, I think it's a solid-state. You know, it has a bunch of different inputs, but then it does have an amplifier that I use to power those speakers. And the speakers I'm running into are Overnight Sensations, which are a bookshelf speaker, two-way receivers with a woofer and a tweeter. They're relatively inexpensive, probably one of the most beginner-oriented DIY speaker builds that you can do. Would highly recommend them. But to compare and contrast those two setups, I definitely feel like the tube amp, it does give it a little bit more of that character and a little bit more of a personality to the music. Whereas going back to the receiver, I guess I would acknowledge that and I sometimes struggle to know how to describe some of this stuff, and hi-fi is a little bit of a foreign place for me. And sometimes I feel like there can be a lot of disagreement about what contributes to what in the sound, and you really get down to the nitty-gritty. But from my perspective and listening to these two setups, I think that the solid-state amp is definitely a little bit cleaner and a little bit maybe more straightforward. Whereas the tube amp, it does have a little bit more of its own character and personality. The way that it handles dynamics and transients is just a little bit different. There's almost just a little touch of compression and, you know, some of that harmonic content, just making it sound maybe a little bit richer. And overall, it's just a very pleasing sound. One also thought that I have is the Overnight Sensation speakers are a little bit lower in terms of sensitivity. So I don't know if this amp is the best amp to pair with those speakers, because this amp is single-ended. So I found that when I crank up the volume as loud as it can go on my interface, I think I used a sound pressure meter on my phone, which who knows how accurate that is. But it would say I was peaking at about 89 or 90 decibels, and my average was maybe more 83, 84, which I would say is loud, and probably sufficiently loud for like 90% of my listening. But there are times when I maybe like to push it even a little bit louder for kind of a short period of time, just when it's just me. And I don't really have the capability to do that with these speakers, which are lower sensitivity. I know, like my daughter, my 5-year-old, if she's listening to me, I do need to turn the volume down to about half or 3/4. That's where she's comfortable listening at. But I don't really know a tremendous amount about listening levels and where you should be or shouldn't be listening. I guess I just kind of do what feels good and feels right to me. And I would say that, like I said, I think this amp being single-ended would pair a little bit more nicely with a higher sensitivity speaker. So you know, go figure, I've actually been looking into designing and building some of those. So I'll let you know how that goes here probably in the future. The other thing that I would note is that the solid-state amp has a lot more power behind it. I'm sure in terms of wattage, it's probably hundreds of watts, maybe 100 or 200 watt amp. So it has a lot more power capability, and that amp really does have the ability to push those speakers way beyond, like, into full-on distortion, and it gets really unpleasant at that point. You know, for the most part with that amp, the volume on the amp I'm limiting to about 2/3 or 3/4, and then the volume on my interface, I really only get it up between 1/4 and halfway. So it does have a lot more capability in terms of power. But at the same time, it doesn't always have some of that character and the intimacy and just, I guess, maybe the connection I'm feeling with it. But I also acknowledge, subjectively speaking, that I built this hi-fi amp, and so I'm kind of rooting for it subconsciously to sound really good. And maybe at some point I'll try to do a double-blind taste test or a ear test and see how that goes. But any which way, overall, I'm really thrilled with how it has turned out. This has been a terribly fun project. I will leave a schematic down below. If you want maybe some of the PCB plans, let me know, and I'll get that updated, and I can maybe get an order off and let you guys in on that. But this has been a really fun process. So see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.